I'm Victoria Main, CEO at Convida Associates. Welcome to our last Brussels Calling Media panel of 2021. In fact, it's our last before we rebrand as SEC Newgate EU in January. Today's focus is on the impact that next year's presidential elections in France will have on the country's presidency of the EU Council. When Emmanuel Macron unveils his French presidency priorities on Thursday, there's every sign that we'll see a muscular France taking the helm of Europe as he seeks to retain the Elysée presidential palace. We can expect strategic autonomy, whatever that may mean in practice, to be writ large on this presidency. But amidst all the electioneering, what real progress will we see on the key EU priorities of digital and green? Or will the presidency be hostage to the presidentials? To quiz our panel on these questions and more, we're thrilled to have Sir Ivan Rogers as our moderator. Amongst his numerous prestigious roles, Sir Ivan was the UK's ambassador to the EU from 2013 to 2017. He's also held senior positions in the private sector, namely at Citigroup and Barclays Capital. Known as a critical thinker, Sir Ivan is a very active participant in the debate on European affairs. Now to our panel. In alphabetical order, I'm delighted to welcome Gabriel Grésillon at Les Echos, the French financial and economic daily. Gabriel has recently returned to Paris as an investigative reporter after a combined 11 years in Brussels and Beijing. Sophie Pedder has been Paris bureau chief at The Economist since 2003. She witnessed the last French presidency in 2008. She's also covered numerous presidential elections. Sophie is a Macron biographer. Her book, Emmanuel Macron and the Quest to Reinvent a Nation, was published in 2018. Alex Pigman has been a Brussels correspondent with AFP since 2014, covering economic affairs, trade, tech, and competition. US-born, Alex has spent a big chunk of his career in Europe and picked up French nationality along the way. Céline Schoen is EU correspondent for French daily La Croix and a regular commentator on EU affairs. Céline is therefore well placed to give insights on what we can expect during France's presidency and its presidentials. Many thanks to you all for being with us today. Sir Ivan, the floor is yours, and to our audience I say, please feel free to feed questions into the chat and they'll be taken during the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, Victoria. Really delighted to do it. Sorry it's the last one, but looking forward to your rebrand and very good luck with that. A fantastic panel that you convened this morning. So welcome to everybody who's on the line. You'll want to listen to them and not me. Just three quick thoughts from me as a kind of ex-insider in the system about French presidencies, or indeed any presidency. First thing about all French presidencies is it'll be dynamic, professional, and interesting, because they always are, and it's a super smart system with very good people running it, and there'll be no change there. I wasn't around as you say, Victoria, in the 2008 presidency, because I was out there ruining the private sector at the time that Sarkozy was trying to save the world. I remember the 2000 presidency very well, not least because it ended in a 5-day European Council at the Nice summit, and most of us ran out of shirts for that European Council as it lasted 5 days and culminated in the Nice Treaty. I'm not sure whether that was a good or a bad thing, personally. First thing to say about presidencies is there's a limit to what any presidency these days can really introduce into the agenda that's kind of new. And that's particularly true post-Lisbon Treaty. Presidencies have less scope to improvise than they did before Lisbon. And in the end, they're inheritors of what's coming through the sausage machine in Brussels and Strasbourg, more than able to kind of instigate and prompt new debates. That can be a bad thing, I think, for the European Union, and it's a problem for presidencies who only have 6 months in the sun every 14 years or so these days. But it's just a fact of life. So what the French are dealing with in Brussels to a large degree is what they've inherited and what they'll be dealing with the trio presidencies they are They are the first of the trio. The second very obvious thing, and I'll come to the panel very shortly on that, is, if you're in an election year, your domestic politics trumps all else. And if you're Monsieur Macron, the only thing you really care about in 2022 is winning and being back for the following 5 years. And I would have thought in Paris, everything will be seen through that prism. Literally everything in the EU arena, but beyond the EU arena, because you're in a pre-election mode, and it'll be a really lively and probably nasty election that we're facing. So everything will be viewed through that optic. What evidence can I give on that from a British perspective? I wasn't in Brussels, of course, in the last British presidency, but I was in number 10 Downing Street working as Blair's principal private secretary in 2005. We had the presidency in the second half of 2005. That was, of course, just after our election rather than during an election campaign, so slightly less difficult for us. But I think what I can tell you as an ex-insider is the election there and the planning for Blair's third term, which of course only lasted for less than half a term, really dominated our lives. And we did very little thinking. I mean, not none, but very little serious strategic thinking about what the presidency would be about. And of course, the presidency was on us within 7 weeks of the general election. I think what was interesting about 2005, and that was the last UK presidency, because of course we never had the one in 2017. So that was the last one we held. Blair started with very, very high ambitions and gave one of his more interesting speeches on Europe. I would have to say he didn't give very many interesting speeches on Europe, certainly not in the UK, but gave one or two on the European continent. And the one at the beginning of the presidency in 2005 was an interesting one, well worth going back to, and high ambitions for reform post the major enlargement of the European Union. Of course, what in practice happened is what frequently happens to presidencies and may happen to the French presidency as many other presidencies, which is life was not about what was in his July 2005 speech. And in the end, it was about the future financing package, what's now become the MFF. And of course, in the days before we had a permanent council presidency and the kind of Van Rompuy role, the then rotating presidency had the responsibility of trying to resolve the financial issues. And actually that dominated his life. It dominated my life as principal private secretary for the last 3 months of 2005. It was extremely bitter inside Whitehall, including with the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. I won't go into details on that. Of course, it ended up with the settlement we got in 2005. And some may reflect, I occasionally reflect, that that ended up with disapplying the UK rebate to structural fund spending in Central and Eastern Europe, which was obviously morally the right thing to do. What that resulted in, of course, was more than tripling the UK's net contribution to the EU budget. And if you want the explanation for why the figure that appeared on the side of the bus in 2016 appeared on the side of the bus, all the ground was laid in the UK presidency of 2005. So I think the final lesson on presidencies is, sort of be careful what you say at the beginning of presidencies, because what you say at the end of presidencies may be very different, and you may have dealt with very different things. But you may also find that there are very long-lasting consequences from your presidency, because things have a way in Brussels of coming back to haunt you many years or sometimes decades after you've resolved them. So that's enough from me. I think I'd like to pass first to Sophie to say, if I may, to say what does this look like, and what does the European scene look like, and how important is it to Macron in the next few months, or is it essentially something to be kept relatively low key and quiet, or do you think he wants the whole European agenda and strategic autonomy agenda to bulk large in the presidential election?
Thanks, Sir Ivan. I thought, and thank you, Victoria, for organising this and inviting me to take part. I thought that was fascinating listening to you about the British presidency, I have to say. It's always, I think, it's just always so different when it comes to France. I mean, the French relationship to the EU has never been, as I'm stating the absolute blindingly obvious, the same as the British relationship to the EU. So a presidency here is, it's almost something sort of sacred. I mean, it's an opportunity an extraordinary opportunity to showcase France, to use the megaphone to open shop windows all over the country, to sort of shine the light on France. And that is a part of the equation that is definitely framing the kind of way that the French are thinking about it. But they are also very aware of the risks. And I think it's exactly this tension that we're going to see in the next 6 months. This will be a very high profile French presidency. I have no doubt about that. Europe, the European Union, Europe more generally is part of Emmanuel Macron's DNA. It's part of it's the way in which he thinks everything. When he's sort of doing his big picture vision thing, Europe is absolutely part of that. European sovereignty was the very center of that speech he made in the Sorbonne back in September 2017, which was his first moment really to lay out what he thought Europe ought to be. And it was packed with ideas, some of them completely unrealistic, but some of them already achieved. And so I think that that is absolutely where all his instincts lie. Having said all that, the last thing he's going to want to do ahead of an election, and don't forget this election is even earlier than normal, it's the April the 10th and 24th of the 2 rounds next year. Usually it's the end of April and beginning of May, so it's even earlier than usual. The last thing he's going to want is to have divisive battles between the Mediterranean countries and the frugals, or France and Germany on anything. So what the French have been busy trying to do is look at what are deliverables, what are actually achievable outcomes. And in that sense, it feeds very much into what you've said, and that's what's coming along. They are very clever at wrapping up what's coming along as ideas that they have been pushing from the beginning, and they will not hesitate to claim those as victories for France, even if they were actually in the works for a long time. So on tech, that's obviously things like the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the carbon border tax. They'll certainly put that as part of the part of the discussion and part of the sort of the green agenda that Macron's pushing. But I think, and I'll stop before going on for too long, but I do think that one of the most important things is going to be having that the sort of bigger debate as well. So some concrete deliverable achievements that Macron can say, I did this, and some kind of discussion about what does sovereignty mean? What does it mean to try, what does European autonomy mean? These phrases are, thrown out there by Macron all the time, sometimes difficult for people to understand, sometimes perhaps deliberately ambiguous because they, by definition, involve contradictions and tensions within both France and the EU. But I think we will see a lot of debate nonetheless, and including, particular summits where that, when the French do their informal summit, that will be the sort of central discussion. So I think that for the French, it's partly about concrete achievements, but it's also about making that debate move forward. And I do think in that respect, they see a real opportunity with this new government in Germany, to, the coalition agreement refers to strategic sovereignty, and that sense of sort of getting the conversation to move in the French direction is also going to inform this summit. And I'll stop there. We can come back and talk to some of those.
No, that's great, Sophie. Thanks very much. I'd very much like to come back to that conversation. So if I could come to Celine next, also Paris-based. I mean, I'm fascinated by this combination of the strategic autonomy discussion and pushing this the entire conversation about Europe's strategic future in a more French direction, and the kind of concrete. How do you see it?
Thanks a lot, Ivan, and thanks a lot, Victoria, for organizing this today. So just for us to be clear, I'm based in Brussels. I've been there for 5 years, and I work as EU correspondent for the French daily L'Écho. So yeah, I've been writing a lot already on this concept of strategic autonomy, and that's a very new concept in Brussels as well, and something that has been put on the table by a few nations. But there's been a lot of struggles already concerning this issue, because some countries are saying it should be a kind of open strategic autonomy, while France would be very reluctant to add this open adjective at the beginning of it, just because they want to make sure that, you know, Europe is not going in the direction of protectionism, which is really not the way that France is willing to support at the moment. It's not something France would be seen as a supporter of protectionism. So I guess during the 6 coming months, this concept of autonomic strategy will really be pushed forward by Emmanuel Macron and by the entire French delegation. But it's really not the only thing they want to work on. Sophie mentions the tech sector, and I'm guessing that for France, having agreements on the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act would be very, very successful. They're really dreaming of having that, but on the DSA, it for sure will be a bit complicated. Something else they mention a lot is this concept of social Europe. So that's a bit tricky because in terms of socials, there's not really a European competence, but still they are, for example, willing to have an agreement between the Council and the Parliament on this idea of having fair minimum wages everywhere in Europe. And that again could be something which would be powerful on the French scene. To be able to say that they've been having this file as a success during this 6 months. So yes, there's a lot of work ahead for the French delegation here in Brussels.
Thanks, Celine. There's a vast amount in that. In fact, I wonder if I could come to Alex for his kind of perspective on this from the kind of Brussels end, because, you know, when some delegations hear strategic autonomy, it seems to me, some of those delegations were quite close to us when we were in the European Union. They do hear protectionism, and they view it as protectionist, and they view it as closed, and they're suspicious that it's an old style French agenda masquerading under slightly new language. I mean, how do you read this at the Brussels end, Alex, and kind of how do you see this debate evolving over the months of the French presidency?
Well, I think, and again, thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's really an honor to be here. I think that the debate on strategic autonomy has forced, and the fact that yes, the UK is no longer part of the European Union, has forced certain countries to come out and be much more forceful and forthright about their arguments against something like that is sort of on the face of it so French. So you have countries like, you know, especially like, let's say like the Netherlands, but, you know, what used to might have called the Northern Lights, who now have to come out and they have to put out their position papers saying like, well, we want a strategic open economy. And so we get into this kind of like this Brussels silliness, for lack of a better word, about trying to insert like different words in order to sort of like to nudge the concept over into something that's less French and less Napoleonic, I dare say. And so that debate is very much taking place, and I think that even France is aware of it. There was a little sort of a think tank paper that Clément Beaune asked to be written up, where for the presidency, where they humbly asked for the French presidency to be less Victor Hugo and more Robert Schuman. So saying like, where all these concepts and these great sort of French flairs can be a little bit more agreed in a sort of more collegial way, and maybe have a little less of the Frenchness to them. And I think it's worth noting that this presidency is a little bit of the last hurrah for Philippe Léglise-Costa, who is sort of this figure of, let's say, the old school French Quai d'Orsay, maybe vaguely imperial kind of vision of France and its role in Europe. And it'll be very interesting to see after this presidency, like what comes afterwards. And there, if Macron does become, does win the election, like there he'll really be able to sort of like pick his person to be in that role of the French representative, and will French policy take on a more sort of Clément Beaune kind of, have a more sort of Clément Beaune typeface, who went to the College of Europe, who spends a lot of time in Brussels, and is sort of one of the gang in the EU bubble. So I think it is an interesting moment. Will this presidency be the last hurrah, maybe, of the Pierre Salal, of the old school of French Franco-German vision of Europe?
Fascinating. So, Gabrielle, come to you last. How do you read that, and how do you see both the European end of this debate and the French debate evolving over the next few months, and where do you see the real potential political benefits of this for Macron in the next few months?
Hi, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Of course, it's very difficult to answer your question because it's a lot of speculation, and we should never forget that. You should not. No one knows what's going to happen with COVID or whatever. So yeah, we all have to be very careful about the future. But I agree with everything that has been said, and in particular, I think there is an opportunity for things to move on and for France to achieve some strategic goals, because maybe there has not been a lot of strategic thinking during the last couple of months, but in a sense, there has been a strategic thinking from France since, the Sorbonne speech, as Sophie has just said, So this can be seen as the end of a long-term process. And Macron is really willing to pick up, the ripe fruits now. And what I think we should keep in mind also is that there is in Berlin, probably, once again, it's a bit early to say, but there is probably a momentum in Berlin. The new coalition government wants to lead the EU also, probably, and has to demonstrate, has to prove that there is a life after Angela Merkel, So it would be really good for them to be able to prove to their electors that they have been able to achieve great things on the EU stage quite rapidly. So I think it's a win-win. It could be a win-win moment between France and Germany. And maybe another argument is that not everyone loves Macron in Europe because his attitude sometimes can be a bit I don't know, arrogant, or you can call it the way you want to call it. But most people know that he's willing to push Europe in the right direction, and is very he has a positive attitude. And so I think in Berlin, probably regarding the French election, people would probably tend to say, this election is dangerous. We don't know who could win this election, and some of the candidates are seen as scary. So there is probably a willingness. Once again, it's a win-win. It makes sense to help Macron achieve some positive results. So I think one could expect, despite the fact that it's going to be very short, no doubt it's going to be 3 months instead of 6 in a sense. But I think you could still expect some results.
Very interesting. Obviously, all eyes are really on, the new Berlin regime, as you say, and where it will come from, given the potential tensions between Scholz and the Greens on the one hand and Lindner on the other. So particularly, is there any margin for maneuver in the finance ministry, or will, time-honored German positions essentially prevail on the kind of fiscal debate in particular? As you say, it does seem quite likely that they, if you're sitting in Berlin, the best result in the French election would be a Macron victory. I don't know what relations would be like with Pécresse should she get into the final round. So, but the big question for all of us, I think, is does that prompt any serious reflection inside the German system on, what are fairly ancient and bipartisan or tripartisan positions? Will we see a real, because whatever one thought of Merkel and her tactical genius at European councils and beyond was very visible to people like me, and she was an absolutely formidable figure. I don't think even her best friends would accuse her of having a massive, strategic vision for the future of Europe. Will we see something different from the German administration? I mean, it's probably an unfair question to ask you, Gabriel, given it's the very early days. They've only just taken office. But is there a lot of French work going on behind the scenes with the kind of new Germans to establish where they can make some serious progress in the next few months?
Not that I know, and you know, I'm not a specialist of German politics, so I probably should not be the one answering this question. But I think from what the coalition government has said initially, you can see some keywords, you know, some keyword like federalism or so. What I think we can see at this stage is a philosophy, and once again a willingness to lead. And maybe one could say that it's related to the fact that there has been frustration accumulating, given the fact that Macron has taken, in a way, the lead, at least in terms of thinking the future of Europe during the last 4 years. So there's a sense of urgency, I think, in Berlin to come back on the first, you know, stage and say we are back and we have great projects for the EU as a whole. So that's all I can say at this stage. But what exactly is going to happen between the FDP and the Greens and I mean, maybe it will all come down at the end of the day to whether or not Scholz is able to lead, take a leadership and make bold steps, you know. But this is something I really don't know.
There is an interesting example in the coalition contract to illustrate what Gabriel has just said. It's on the conference on the future of Europe. It's really as if Berlin was willing to go further than Paris, because what is written in the coalition contract is that if reforms are needed at the end of the process, well, let's do it and let's change the treaties if needed. And that's something that Emmanuel Macron never said himself. He was always saying that, yes, we should listen to citizens. But on the council side, it's very tough for member states to agree to open this Pandora box of reforming the treaties. And here, having these three parties in Germany saying they would go, as Gabriel was saying, towards a federalist system and to reopen the treaties, that's very meaningful. And that truly illustrates what Gabriel has just explained, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very important because, you know, having lived through much of this over the last decade, when there was appetite, of course, in London for treaty change for our own purposes, but there was never really Eurozone appetite for any treaty change which would reopen the treaties for fear of what would happen with their own publics if they did. If this is a real change in the German position where, you know, you are now able to open up the treaties, I mean, good luck if they do, in a way, because then you're going to have to deal with a convention and a European Parliament, and goodness knows where the treaty change really comes out, when you may start with the best of intentions but end somewhere different. But, you know, how do others read this? Is this Alex, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I just think that it's also a question of like this changing of styles and the way of doing politics, which is you have this new, I mean, I agree completely with what Celine just said, in the sense that I think we all assume that the Conference of Europe, the Conference on the Future of Europe, was always intended to somehow achieve treaty change or bring Europeans to this political moment where, like, well, look at this lovely report we just written up. I have an idea. Let's do treaty change. You know, it's just sort of as if a new company was, you know, your company had just been taken over, and this is sort of like, we're going to have a listening tour, and guess what? At the end of the listening tour, we have this plan. And that was always sort of like the somewhat cynical take on what the Conference of the Future of Europe was going to be. But yet here you have this new government coming in Germany, which is, you know, embraces these new sort of new democracy of being more transparent ethos. And they're saying, well, actually, let's just say what we're actually really doing. And that's not very Quai d'Orsay, and that's not very French. You know, that's not very the way things are done in the Jacobin system, which is the Énarque comes in and with his secret little plan, and then sort of magically hatches it and tries to persuade you it was your idea at the end of it. So I just think that this is the new world that France is entering, and where a lot of the way things are being increasingly done in Brussels are reflect more of what we're seeing in Germany. And I find that absolutely absolutely fascinating, because it's so it's so un-Jacobin, it's so un-French. So I'm really curious to see where that goes.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, Sophie, any reflections at your end? I mean, in the end, what will matter, I assume, to the French is still the old fiscal debate, the debate about fiscal rules, stability and growth pact, the sense that, you know, the German system has consistently been in the wrong place as regards, you know, the future of the Eurozone and its future evolution. That always mattered to Macron when he was a Sherpa, and I recall him as a Sherpa. I imagine it still matters to him, and now it matters to the whole kind of what Alex calls the ENARC system. Do they put this debate on hold, though, during their presidency, and then hope to see an evolution after their presidency in German thinking, or are there ambitions even in the lifetime of the presidency to make some serious progress on the fiscal issues?
Well, I'm just going to come back on one thing first, and that's this sort of ENARC vision. Macron is abolishing ENARC. Has anyone taken that on board? I mean, interesting point, because he's still setting up a new Institute of Public Administration, which is going to replace it. But these are not sort of utterly meaningless decisions. And I think that Alex, I was very interested in your idea that the Clement Beaune sort of version of Europe is different, and I think that is true. Clement has been organising these debates and conferences all over France over the last few months, where he gets people, citizens, to kind of discuss Europe. Now, you could say that's just a sort of fig leaf for decisions that have already been made, or you could say it reflects something, and I think it is part of what how he thinks about Europe, which is much more consultative, much more sort of, possibly there is some overlap there with the way that the new German government might be thinking about consulting, trying to make this a bit more of a sort of bottom-up event. I think it's very easy to caricature the French position, and we all do it, but it's a little, I would argue it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it depends who you're talking about. And I think Clement Beaune's a good example of someone who really does try to sort of embody a different generational approach to thinking about consultation and where things come from. Sir Ivan, on your point about the fiscal rules, it's not an official objective for the EU presidency, and it can't be, because it's impossible to achieve anything meaningful in the 6 months, which will, in reality, be reduced to 3 months of sort of proper debate, substantive debate. But it's not a secret either that both Macron and the French government think that these rules are outdated. When I did that interview with Macron, where he said that NATO was experiencing brain death, at that point, that was November 2019, and at that point he already was making it quite clear, and he had done even when he was economy minister, I think the phrase he used was that the fiscal rules belong to another era, something like that. So these aren't surprises. There is a slight difficulty for the French in making that argument now, with Pécresse being the candidate sitting opposite Macron and potentially being a quite serious challenger to him. She has been the one, I would say, the one sort of position that she's taken very clearly that distinguishes her policies from Macron is about public spending. So she has, accused him of burning through cash, of taking public debt seriously, of not taking budget deficit seriously. And I think, they're only really beginning to take on what it means to have Pécresse as their main opponent in the sort of serious mainstream side of politics. But that is her argument, and it is a difficult one for Macron to defend. Now, if he goes into the presidency saying, all we want to do is loosen rules because they don't make any sense and they've never made any sense, there's going to be a little bit of tension there as well, and it might open the door to her to be able to accuse him of being fiscally irresponsible. So I think my instinct would say they're not going to, and anyway we know they can't make proper concrete progress in any meaningful way on this, but I suspect it will be part of the conversation, and they'll be very pragmatic about how far they can push it and how far it can be part of a sort of bigger conversation about economic policy in Europe more generally. What's the European model? What sort of economic environment do we want to support growth and recovery post, or with living with COVID? So I suspect I would imagine it more to be part of that conversation rather than a clear sort of timeline of objectives to get changes made to those rules.
Yeah, that figures. That does sound right. Now, I hadn't realised that Pécresse would major, quite as much on kind of, domestic fiscal policy and spending constraints. So it's that's kind of very familiar from the UK environment. But to see the right going back to that.
She's quite sort of traditional Tory in some ways, I think. Not a current Tory, but an old previous pre-Brexit
old style one, yeah. No,
yes, exactly. Traditional cultural positions, family values positions, but also traditional fiscal conservative as well.
And could be, therefore, if she got to the final round, really quite a difficult opponent for him.
A difficult opponent, but different. She's absolutely sort of socially liberal. She voted against gay marriage, for example, in the National Assembly in 2013. So I mean, she is different to Macron. She's not socially liberal, but she is fiscally conservative, and she does have a sort of a traditional Tory, I would say, political position.
We got about 10 minutes to run, I think, Victoria, haven't we? So do fire in any questions via the chat if you want to. Just to come to perhaps back to some of the concrete deliverables, as you've all talked about the desire to achieve some things and to mark some things off and to achieve some legislative gains, and obviously Digital Services Act is one of them. The carbon border adjustment thing interests me enormously as well, because that's very high ambition. It's one element of kind of strategic autonomy as well as green policy. It's very difficult to do. It is obviously potentially controversial with Russia, China, US, indeed UK, I suspect. How do you see the concrete deliverables? What's gettable? What's tangibly gettable in the next 6 months that is seriously worth doing? Who wants to go first on that? What's really deliverable by the end of June, which they can mark as a great negotiating and legislative triumph?
I volunteered Alex.
No, I think the DSA, DMA, they're there. I mean, as Celine said earlier, the minimum wage framework, these are all things that in the sausage making, they've reached the stages where they can go to the well-named trilogues, the sexily named trilogues, and the French civil service can do what they do best and get these things and get deals on those. I think on health, I think they're going to try to, obviously on COVID, I think they're going to try to get some deliverables there. But yeah, I mean, I think the DSA, DMA are quite clearly.
And what do you see as the deliverables on COVID? I mean, obviously depending on events that are unfolding, but what do you see as the institutional or what are the deliverables thereafter?
I have to say that for me, it's not my beat, but maybe Celine will know better. But I mean, I know I mean, for example, the health ministers are meeting today, and I think that there's this hydra. I mean, I'll let her speak, but there are a few proposals in trying to get a sort of a more centralized response to future pandemics and things like that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what we have to keep in mind also at the moment is that it's a special moment for the French presidency to take up the Council of the EU right now, just because it's been, so the Ursula von der Leyen Commission started working back in December 2019. So that means that the Commission have had a lot of time to put a lot of texts on the table, and it is still doing it at the moment. So what we hear a lot on the French side is that we really are at a legislative peak at the moment.
Yeah, well, true. Yeah.
And so, well, what they are saying is that there are 250 legislative texts on the table at the moment for the French presidency to work on. So we can really expect, to have a few success out of these 250 texts. That's not nothing.
No, I mean, and on COVID, you have a very interesting German health minister appointment, in the last 24 hours, which I don't know his perspectives on the kind of Europeanization, but I mean, they've appointed a serious epidemiologist who's got a major role in the domestic debate as health minister. I think that's going to be quite interesting. I mean, the problem certainly seen from our perspective, and you've had exactly the same problem in the British system, has been, is the European Commission, much as I'm a great admirer of lots of elements of the European Commission, is it very well equipped to handle a crisis like this and many other crises that it's faced? Or is it equipped to sort of handle the crises and the legislative agendas of the 1980s and 1990s, but not very well equipped to handle, which isn't its fault necessarily. It may be the fault of the council not giving it the attention and the resources it needs. But a crisis like this doesn't necessarily need a classic European Commission approach to handle it, I think. But I don't want to be unfair from the outside, because I simply don't know enough about it other than kind of what I read in various presses. But I do think this question of where Europe collectively goes on pandemic handling and health issues is quite a big one, but it's an intractable set of issues. What else is tangibly gettable that really matters, and can one say that it really matters other than to those who tick it off as a legislative success? Gabrielle, any thoughts?
I'm sorry, my mind is a bit confused because I can see also a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, well, far away on the phone.
And so I can see people asking if Brexit is going to play a big role in French politics in the next 6 months.
Okay, you go. We were going to keep off the Brexit question. I should have said that at the outset, because otherwise we never. But
the answer is,
you go away.
Is probably no. I mean, we can probably answer no. It will not play a big role in the next 6 months in France. And people asking also about the French presidency, which wants to have all internal documents in French.
Yes.
And what does it mean? What does it mean for the next 6 months?
I'd be surprised if they did anything else, really, I must say. But I would have been amazed had they not gone for that. But it won't be massively welcome in certain quarters I know well in Coreper, I think.
I don't think we should expect France to propose a reform to make French the new single official language in the EU, the meaning of the question. But yes, I mean, it's in the French DNA to think that the EU is a multilingual group of countries. And I would add something, which is that there's also a fear that people are getting more and more, I mean, people don't care about the EU. The more the EU becomes an English-speaking technocratic machine, the less people can feel connected to it. So that's probably one of the main reasons why France is still pushing using French in institutions. But of course, it doesn't mean that we should not use German or Italian or any other language. And of course, you can also probably add that there's a small political dimension in it, I mean, internal politics, in the sense that it's quite nice to be able to say to the French audience that we are pushing French in the EU institutions, but it doesn't mean much more than that.
We got a couple of quick questions from the chat, and I'll fire those to you, and then Victoria wants us to wrap up. First question is, which is a good one, although the answer may or may not be self-evident. Which French presidential candidate would the Germans like least to emerge as the victor? So that's the first question. Probably it's a short list of 2 or 3, I imagine. Second question is a good one. Is there a risk of creating a two-speed Europe with core and peripheral countries? Perhaps some would say this is less of a risk than an opportunity. Perhaps some in Paris would say this was less of a risk than an opportunity, and it's always been a long-standing kind of French agenda that we could go back to a proper core Europe with more on the periphery who didn't necessarily join everything. But who wants to go on either of those? Who would the Germans like least? And then is there a risk that out of the Future of Europe exercise, we end up having a sort of a multi-speed or multi-destination Europe?
I'm happy to talk about, I don't know German politics, but I think it's pretty obvious who most of Brussels would like least, and either of the 2 candidates on the far right, who are hostile to Europe to varying degrees. We've got 2 of them this time in the election. We've got Eric Zemmour as well as Marine Le Pen. I mean, you know, I always hesitate to say the chances are that they won't be elected, because we've lived through so many counter examples of those sort of certainties. But the chances, I would say, are very, very slim. But nonetheless, those it goes without saying would be the most difficult candidates, presidencies for anybody anywhere, most in Europe, outside a couple of countries that we don't need to name.
And any quick thoughts on, you know, two-speed, you know, Macron, you know, when Macron was talking to Cameron, you know, they didn't overlap for many years, but actually there was a bit more common ground between Macron and Cameron than there was between Hollande and Cameron, admittedly not a very difficult bar to jump, where, you know, some of Macron's perspectives on where European integration should go accommodated certain elements of what Cameron had in mind, really, which is that, you know, those who didn't really want to join specific projects which went beyond the single market and customs union had no obligation to join, and there might be sort of variable geometry where coalitions of the willing would proceed, whether that was on defence or monetary union or multiple other things, and others would not have the obligation always to join. Is that still?
I just think that, I mean, just very quickly, is that there's been plenty of opportunity for people to sign up for the lower speed of a two-speed Europe, and since Brexit, no one seems to have. The latest example is Sweden, which is basically voted for this minimum wage thing.
Yeah,
2 days ago, you know, and it's just sort of like, and that was, I mean, I wanted to say in a little way, it was kind of a historic moment that Sweden signed up to that.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't know who's signing up for it.
The Brexit experience, or what others have seen of the Brexit experience from elsewhere, has put people off precisely where, you know, a more intelligent version of the Brexit agenda might ultimately have ended up.
Yeah.
So if you think the kind of Cameron agenda, you know, certainly as I understood it, was a more multi-destination Europe, not multi-speed, but multi-destination, right, where there was more scope to have different levels of integration with which one ever felt comfortable. That's become a more distant prospect, precisely as a result of us doing what we did, really.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Any other quick thoughts? Victoria's looking at me as if we better stop soon, I think.
No. Well, if you are all happy to continue, we can.
Yeah, I'm very happy to, but
how do our panelists feel about a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, if you just very quickly, and then we probably should stop. But I agree, and Alex's point is really interesting, and it's very striking that Brexit has had unexpected consequences for the way in which Europe has gone. Having said that, I do think, nonetheless, that, you know, where Macron's coming from is, as you described it, Sir Ivan, that's to say, you know, open to flexible arrangements, and those flexible arrangements include countries that aren't in the EU as well. I mean, he's right from the start had wanted to, it's extremely difficult under the current British government, but had wanted to work with the UK on defence matters.
Exactly.
EU, his European Intervention Initiative, was precisely to try and bind the UK into a post-Brexit security arrangement. These things, you know, are very difficult with the UK, but we're not going to go there at the moment. But but in terms of his thinking, that is the way it is. And, you know, you can see it all the time. You know, he's very much less into this uniform, one-size-fits-all sort of thinking about Europe than he is into a pragmatic seeking of agreements, coalitions of the willing. If even in the Sahel, you see that, for example, in the Takuba task force, which is the sort of reworking of the Barkhane operation there. It's, you know, it's whoever wants to join, please do. We need you, but you know, no obligation sort of approach. So I think that is part of the way he thinks about things, despite the fact that, as Alex said, we've got this strange situation where actually post-Brexit there is a sort of a kind of a push towards everyone signing up for everything.
Yes. No, it may come back, and it may come back, you know, post a Johnson government here, but I think it's probably so, you know, many years away. You know, a different government with a different complexion and a different view of Europe. Not a government that, you know, wanted to rejoin, but wanted to rethink the relationship and go deeper than just the TCA framework. You know, might be up for elements of this, and there might be a conversation to be had. It does seem to me to be, certainly from a British perspective, which is not the, you know, not the only perspective on kind of how do you deal with the close neighbourhood but I think it's many years away, and certainly post a Johnson government. But I mean, there may be scope with certainly the way the German Greens think about federalism, which is not at all the way federalism is viewed in the UK. There is a set of discussions to be had here about a different conception of European Union and its periphery, I think. But I think it's years off, personally, from a UK perspective. I'm just interested in whether that will get a degree of momentum out of the Future of Europe exercise, particularly if the German government is more open to this kind of flexible thinking itself. So have we got any other questions to pick up? I think there was one that came in which said, which was well beyond my ability even to ask properly. Do you think the French presidency is likely to play a crucial role in pushing for a quick release of the EU sustainable corporate proposal? Anybody got a go on that? Not sure we're qualified to judge.
No.
Sorry about that to whoever asked it, but I'm not sure you've got a panel capable of answering it.
We've got a fantastic panel, though, nonetheless. And I think this is, Sir Ivan, and panelists, if it's okay with you, I think, you know, all good things have got to come to an end. A big thank you to you all. What a fantastic way to start a Tuesday morning. It's been a really lively, informative debate. One of our best ever, I'd say. A great way to end Brussels Calling as Canberra. Let me reassure everybody, it's going to be back. Brussels Calling will be back as SEC Newgate EU. And a big thank you also to our audience for overcoming, battling screen fatigue to join us this morning. So I really appreciate it to everyone. Thank you very much.